There we go. Forge, gang! Let's go! Awesome. All right, so I will now cover the geopolitics of the Korean Civil War, or known in the United States as the Korean War. So let me make sure that I'm coming in clearly. I'm going to check my stream right fast and make sure that I'm coming in clear. Testing. Looks real hazy. Huh, my stream looks really freaking hazy.
Test.
Yeah, that's it. All right. We're live. Forge, gang! Let's go! Little shimmy in the house, just be rilin' with the best. You know that this is the Thrill Z. I just play it really easy. I'm going to bang up on Tessie. Let's just be getting it. Number one, A log and IP2, yo. That's for sure, yo. It's your number one royal on the street. Oh, it's the Warhammer Roo. The Warhammer Roo. All right. So I'll talk about some of the geopolitics of the Korean War. Excuse me. Anyways, the Korean War is what would be called one of the many hot contestive or combative areas of the Cold War, which was something of an arms race between the Americans and the Russians. And the Cold War was an ideological civilizational competition between two very different ideological camps. And while most of the time there wasn't no real actual fighting taking place between the superpowers, there were sometimes occasionally hot contested spots in the world where sort of these flare-ups, if you will, of the Cold War would take place. Another thing, too, about the Cold War is that this happened in the Far East, and it was an aspect of the aftermath of the Second World War, where you have the process of decolonization or decolonizing, where all of the major imperialist powers before World War II or World War I began to go into a major process of decolonizing, abandoning their colonies. Well, maybe not abandon, but giving their colonies a gradual transition to full self-autonomy and then outright independence. Case in point with Great Britain. Great Britain created the Commonwealth of Nations, or the British Commonwealth, in which all of the white dominions were allowed to join. And then later, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Ghana, Nigeria, and so forth, and South Africa were able to join the Commonwealth of Nations. And then the British, by and large, gave independence to all of these various colonies and gradually left and retreated to being only a regional power in the the Northeast Atlantic. So that's kind of what I would, say about decolonialism. So the European world order is very quickly shifted away to more of a competition between hot superpowers that are engaged in a non-combative but ever ready, ever prepared nuclear just short of nuclear assault or nuclear fallout standoff. Mutually assured destruction, otherwise known as the Cold War. So Korea had been ruled by the Joseon dynasty, and it was under the influence of China for a few centuries. In 1910, the Japanese won a war against the Qing and annexed Korea in 1910. At first, they turned it into a protectorate, and then they outright annexed it. After that happened, after World War II happened, Japan, according to the Treaty of San Francisco, or the Japanese unconditional surrender, they had to liquidate all of their colonies outside of the Japanese archipelago and give them back to their peripheral nations. So Korea was given back its independence, but it was divided at the 38th parallel between the Soviets in the north and the Americans in the south. So the intentional goal or agenda was that Korea would be united and it would become completely independent of both the Russians and the Americans, but it would not be divided, and democratic elections would be allowed in Korea. But this is not what happened. Instead, the Americans installed their own puppet, Syngman Rhee, as head of the Republic of Korea, which was taken from the provisional government of the Republic of Korea, which now ran South Korea. And the Russians installed Kim Jim, or Jim Kun, as the dictator of the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. That was the Korea in the north. Both of these Koreas tried to have free elections, and then there was an attempt to have elections shared by the north and the south sectors. And in 1947, very briefly, the People's Republic of Korea took shape, but it was not able to gain full independence because of the outbreak of the Cold War. And so the People's Republic of Korea never came into being. And from then on, it was divided into two nation states that both claimed to have full hegemony over the entire peninsula. So anyways, in 1948, Syngman Rhee became the leader, the dictator of the authoritarian South Korean Republic, and Kim Jim became the socialist dictator of the People's Democratic Republic of Korea. And the Russians and the Americans both withdrew. And then there was an attempt to spread communist influence into South Korea. And this communist propaganda was then led to be crushed. And so there is a communist insurgency that broke out in South Korea. The communists in South Korea wanted the entire peninsula to be part of North Korea, or the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And so there is an anti-insurgency campaign, something that was very similar to what happened in China. Now, at the same time, Mao Zedong became the chairman of the People's Republic of China, and the entirety of mainland China fell under the red banner of the workers and peasants. It became the People's Republic of China. And so communist guerrilla forces in South Korea, they were trying to fight a war of anti-imperialism and de-Americanization, and to try to make South Korea join the socialist camp on the side of Russia and China. But Syngman Rhee and his accomplices made a successful anti-insurgency campaign, and they put down all of the communist guerrilla forces. So in 1949, Kim Jim, or Kim Jong, invaded South Korea with the support of Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin. It was a very sudden and very brisk invasion. And the attempt on the part of the North Koreans was to engage in an anti-colonialist, anti-imperialist coalition to bring liberation and socialist solidarity into the South. So the Democratic People's Republic of Korea invaded North Korea, and they had much better industry. They had far better weapons and hardware and military capabilities, whereas South Korea only had just small armaments that they got from the Japanese and Americans. And the North Koreans had better propaganda in the sense that in their mind, they were fighting a neo-colonialist regime that was under US imperialism. For the South Koreans, they were fighting an aggressive action by communists to take over and subvert their country into the communist camp. So the North Koreans did very well fighting and in battle, suffered high fatalities, lots of casualties, a lot of bombing campaigns that were going on, and they made it really deep down to the South. There's also a lot of naval warfare that was taking place and a lot of aerial warfare. And this really upset the balance of power between the two different camps. So America the United Nations made a joint resolution to declare war on North Korea for this unabated aggression. What the Americans and the British and the UN supervisory were trying to do was they were trying to checkmate the aggressiveness of the Soviets and the Red Chinese in the face of the fact that back in the 30s, they had done virtually nothing to stop Hitler. They simply just gave Hitler more and more land until he invaded Poland. And it just got worse because they kept allowing the Nazis to annex all these different parts of Central Europe. And so the lesson taken from World War II was that you have to check, like a domino effect, you have to check these aggressors up front right when they are doing it, or they are going to take over more and more countries. And so the Korean War broke out at the backdrop of the McCarthy trials, where there was a lot of anti-communist hysteria going on in the United States, a lot of anti-communist feeling. A lot of people were arrested, lost their jobs, or put on trial for all sorts of reasons about being affiliated with the Communist Party. And so anyways, the United Nations declared a joint resolution that they would help liberate South Korea from the north, and so they invaded. And almost immediately, there was a lot of intensive, violent fighting and warfare that broke out. Also, the Soviet Union boycotted the United Nations when they passed the resolution. Virtually the entire communist bloc boycotted the United Nations. The Soviet Union also threatened retaliation, and the United States threatened to use atomic bombs if the Soviet Union did get directly involved in the Korean War. So that out of the way, the Americans and the Allied United Nations forces, peacekeeping forces, invaded and landed at Pusan or Pusion and began to make a clear out of the area. At this point, the communists had taken over the entire Korean peninsula except one little tiny outcrop that was still held by the pro-Western South Koreans. So the Americans and other UN forces fought back the North, or the communists, to a stalemate, and then they started to reverse the fighting. Now, at first, they had to hold their positions. They were getting bombed and shelled by a lot of strong heavy artillery and tank fire. The Soviets gave the North Koreans their rocket launchers that they fire from their vehicles. It's sometimes called Stalin's Orchestra. It's a type of Russian truck that fires rockets on the back. So a lot of the weapons that the Red Army used against the Wehrmacht in World War II on the Eastern Front was being used by the Chinese and North Koreans against the Americans and allies in the Korean War. There's also a lot of fighting that took place in the air with jets, Russian supplied Korean jet fighters and planes and stuff in the air. The Americans performed a successful naval assault, and that naval assault and landing, which mirrored D-Day landings, enabled a breakout and a clearing of Pusan. And from there on out, the Pusan parameters successfully broke. The stalemate broke in favor of the UN forces, and they pushed the North Koreans back up to the 38th parallel. And keep in mind that the Americans had aerial and naval and tactical superiority. They also had superior tech and radar technology on their side that enabled them to clear out the peninsula. From the breakout, there was a lot of heavy and very violent fighting that took place. And unfortunately, as the Americans pushed past the 38th parallel into the north, there was a lot of atrocities and massacres that were committed against ethnic Koreans. So there was a Harry Truman had already fully desegregated the U.S. armed forces in 1947. But in spite of that, in spite of the end of Jim Crow in the U.S. armed forces, there was still a lot of racial prejudice and a lot of very strong antipathy toward Koreans and Asians, and the Americans massacred and killed a lot of Koreans. At the same time, the Koreans from the north violently fought back and killed a lot of Americans. So there was a lot of violent clandestine warfare taking place between both North and South Koreans. It was a very horrible time. So anyways, the Americans and the UN forces pushed out of Pusan. They cleared out the South and they went through and took Seoul. Seoul, by the way, was taken 4 times during the Korean War. It was completely bombed and ransacked with firebombing. Pyongyang was also firebombed into complete oblivion. The entire infrastructure and village network of North Korea fire and carpet bombed into utter oblivion. So the UN forces pushed further north until they reached the Yalu River, and that is when Chinese forces set up Chinese peasant volunteer units to cross over the Yalu River, which they did very successfully. And then they started en masse, a massive Chinese horde ransacking and rampaging. And even though they had somewhat inferior weapons to the Americans, they fought with extreme tenacity, extreme ideological tenacity against the UN forces, and brutally massacred and killed thousands, tens of thousands of Americans, and took thousands or hundreds of Americans prisoners. At the same time, a lot of Chinese also surrendered to the Americans, and they were forced into internment camps and decommunization or de-ideologicalization camps. So they were placed in sort of these internment camps in the South. So there is a lot of fratricide going on both sides. So the Chinese pushed out of the Yalu River, and the Americans used their air force and their aircraft carriers to bomb various parts of Chinese-held camps, both in Korea and China. And fighting also broke out in the South China Sea and the Sea of Japan. The Soviet Union was almost going to get into the war, but America threatened retaliation with nuclear arsenal, and so the Soviets withheld, but they continued to supply the Chinese and the North Koreans with weapons. And so the Chinese, they were fully supplied and fully validated. and they pushed in massive waves, like 300 something, like 100 or 250,000 something Chinese died in the Korean War, and about 70 or 60,000 Americans died, 2 million Koreans died, and I'm not for sure about the other statistics about the other forces, but regardless, there was for a while a stalemate, but the Americans and the UN forces were pushed back in the face of the massive Chinese counterinsurgency movement. They were pushed back south of Seoul, and at this is the point where the aerial war got really heavy, and a lot of tactical changes and stuff. A lot of great air battles and naval artillery firing and shelling on the North Korean and Chinese coastline. But at this point, the Americans regrouped, they re-strategized, and the UN forces again took the tactical dominance, and they retook Seoul, and they pushed north to about where the DMZ border is at the same area, at the 38th parallel that the Korean War broke out. It is at this point that MacArthur wanted to push into China. Like, they wanted to go all the way into North China, invade North China, and fight the communists in Manchuria, North China, and so forth. But Truman said no. Truman backed away. Most of the American military decided that it was best to fight them into a stalemate. And this was all part of what the United Nations joint resolution about dealing with this aggression was all about. It was not to necessarily fight a total war against communism, but just simply to liberate and validate the sovereignty of the nation state. So fighting continued for about a year and a half at the KMZ line. The Chinese lost a lot of casualties, and the Americans and the UN had the advantage, but over time it just turned into a total stalemate. So a lot of trench warfare or foxhole warfare taking place, a lot of static fighting, a lot of fighting in the air on the seacoasts and so forth. At the same time, all of the major centers of both North and South Korea were carpet bombed into absolute oblivion. North and South Korea were totally razed, totally flattened. So anyways, in 1953, it was agreed to have a truce. So a ceasefire and a truce was agreed upon, but some fighting continued, especially on the side of the Chinese and North Koreans, right down to the minute that the truce was signed. The Chinese and the North Koreans fought on very harshly, very brutally to the very end. And then finally, an armistice or a stalemate was declared. And so this region where the fighting stopped became the demilitarized zone, or the DMZ line, between North and South Korea. And it still exists today. And there are still a bunch of American forces or peacekeeping forces at the DMZ zone. It is the only one of its kind in the entire world, and it is a direct relic from the early Cold War period. And so the fighting stopped. But North and South Korea never signed a treaty. Neither of the warring forces ever signed any kind of peace treaty, any kind of resolution, nothing. It was just a ceasefire and military withdrawal. But anyways, by the end of the 1950s, most of the UN forces and most of the Chinese People's Liberation Army had left the Korean Peninsula. However, in 1967 and again in 1978, there were very brief inter-skirmishes that took place between the North and the South Korean armies, to where there was kind of for like a few hours, there was actually a very brief inter-Korean war. So in 1967, 1968, and again in 1978, there were some hostile clashes that took place. But for the duration of the Cold War period, there was no more hot war in Korea. So 2.5 million Koreans died in the Korean Civil War. The communist totalitarian regime of Kim Jong remained in control in the north and began rebuilding and turning itself into a socialist state on the model of the Soviet Union. South Korea languished under a very strong, brutal, authoritarian dictatorship that was under American backing for the following decades. Syngman Rhee was then later deposed and replaced by a military junta, and South Korea went through several different government transitions until in 1983 a more stable government was set up, which in 1986 became, or in 1987, after democracy riots broke out in South Korea became a more democratic, capitalist-oriented country. And since the 1970s, North Korea has very easily, by far, overtaken North Korea in terms of capital accumulation, in terms of successful business, international business ventures, in terms of just massive shipbuilding, building of cruise ships and yachts, televisions like massive amounts of high tech coming out of North Korea. North Korea to this day is still a predominantly rural agrarian country that kind of languishes under almost really 200 years of backwardness. Like they still live in medieval huts and houses in North Korea. So, anyways, that was my brief take on the Korean War. So, this was perhaps the first major clash between the superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, in the Cold War. It was also the first major hot war for America and Britain to fight in after World War II had ended, and it was part of a larger and much more complex decolonization campaign that was taking place all across the world. So ultimately, the bottom line is that South Korea was saved from being invaded and subverted into becoming part of the Democratic People's Republic, or the DPRK, but the purpose and the agenda of the Americans in liberating the North as well from communism and from Kim Jong was not achieved. It ended in only a 50% success and 50% failure. And because of that, communism, far from retreating or far from breaking apart, was actually very successful, and it continued to grow. It spread into Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and Indochina. It spread to India, to the Middle East, and it spread to Africa and to the Latin American countries. There was communist influence all over the world. And it kind of seemed really as if the Soviets, although they did not directly get involved in the Korean War, had for the most part achieved their main objectives in demonstrating that the Americans were not as sufficiently strong or superior as they made themselves out to be. And that was a pretty big thing back then in the 50s. So, anyways, one of the reasons why also the Korean War drew to a standstill was because the main drivers and proponents in fighting the Korean War non-stop until all the forces were so worn out and so, unable to continue fighting was Joseph Stalin. And Joseph Stalin died in the Kremlin in 1953. And the successors of Stalin did not want to continue this bloody, horrendous war against the so-called imperialist West. So the Korean War drew to a standstill. Very little was actually resolved out of the conflict. And I do want to emphasize how very little was actually achieved in fighting the Korean War. North Korea still exists to this day. It is one of the few communist countries that is actually still around, although lately they have made some concessions to open up trade with China and Russia and even with the South. And they have done a few relative market reforms and have kind of followed a Deng Xiaoping method of mixed economy, but it's still very much ran by an absolute dictator. And South Korea was not by any means in 1954 democratic. It was ran under a very strong right-wing military authoritarian regime under Syngman Rhee, who was actually very little better than his northern counterpart, Kim Jong or Kim Jong. So anyways, yeah. So some of the other things that were going on at the time as the Korean War, you have the Chinese Civil War, where the communists drive the nationalists into Taiwan, and Mao Zedong comes to power in China. You have the very last set of purges by Stalin before he dies. There is also the doctors' scheme, or the purge of the doctors, which never took place. There is the Leningrad affair, where all of the top military generals and commissars in Leningrad were put into gulags and executed. There was the doctors' plot. In America, there was the McCarthy trials, as well as top-notch economic growth, complete domination by American industry in the world. There was also the first Indochina War, where France was fighting the Viet Cong or the Viet Minh under Ho Chi Minh. The French were very badly routed at the Battle of Bien Dinh Phu, and after that, the French withdrew, and the United Nations set up two Vietnams. So already you have the gradual beginnings of what will lead into the Vietnam War. There is also a lot of different stuff about anti-nuclear movements and peace movements and stuff that would later develop into the counterculture movement in the 60s, although in the early 1950s that wasn't apparent. You have the rise of mass consumerism in America and Western Europe. Western Europe recovers relatively quickly from World War II, and West Germany becomes the main economic building block of the EU. So in Western Europe, you have the Commonwealth of European nations joining together in a common market or a common marketplace for Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Italy, and West Germany in 1953. At first, it was just called the Coal and Steel Community, and then it evolves into the Community of Europe. You also have the founding of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, NATO being the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And actually, the Soviet Union tried to actually apply to join NATO, but NATO refused to allow them to go in because the Soviets were looked on as an evil, wicked aggressor, an evil empire of sorts. So the Soviet Union did actually try to join NATO, but it was to no avail. So they created their own Warsaw Pact. So you have all of these different armed camps that are taking shape. You have the First World, which is led by North America, especially the United States and Western Europe and Japan and the new state of Israel. You have the Second World, which is led by the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. And then you have the Third World, which is India, China, Vietnam, Nigeria, Ghana, Argentina, Brazil, and so on and so forth. The so-called, what is now referred to as the developing world. Now, in the mid-1950s, there was an attempt by China, India, and several other Asian and African countries to form their own military alliance against both the communists and the capitalists, and they would be referred to as the neutral world, that is, neutral in the Cold War. This did not take place because in 1962, there was a border clash that led to the Sino-Indian War, where China and India fought over some lands and borders and stuff near the border of Tibet and Nepal, and so that alliance was never able to take shape. Another important thing that also happened was that in 1947, the British mandate in Palestine was given to the United Nations to create a Jewish and an Arab state. So in 1948, the Zionists made a full democratic election and they became the government of Israel, and Israel declared its independence. And when Israel declared its independence, it was immediately attacked by hostile, aggressive Arab states such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon and Jordan. All of these different Arab states invaded and fought Israel, and there was a lot of very heavy, momentous fighting in 1948. It was called the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, or sometimes it is called the Israeli War of Independence. And the Israelis, in spite of all the odds placed against them, succeeded in driving out all of these forces. Now, the Jordanians did occupy the eastern part of Jerusalem, and Israel only had the western part of Jerusalem. Syria had the Golan Heights, and Egypt occupied the Dead Sea, but Israel successfully defended its statehood and its independence. And so in 1947-48, for the very first time since really the Khazars, or even further back, for the first time since Hadrian, for the first time since the Emperor Hadrian and Marcus Aurelius, the Jews have their own independent state. This is the first time that the Jews have been fully independent of foreign Gentile rule since the Maccabees, or since the Maccabees or the Herodians or whatever. So, anyways, this was something that was relatively shocking for a lot of Christians in America and in Britain. The idea that maybe this is the end of the times of the Gentiles and we are at the end of days in the book of Revelation or the book of Daniel, in the sense that once Israel regathers and builds the third temple and the battle of Armageddon takes place, that means that Jesus will return in the second coming, because the Jews will want their Messiah to return, or to have their Messiah come. So there is a lot of this going on as well. But for the most part, most Americans and most Western Europeans were not really that fixated on Israel. Most American evangelical Christians did not even really pay attention to Israel that much until the 1967 Six-Day War. After the Six-Day War, America and Western Europe started to pay a lot more attention to Israel and what was going on in the Middle East. But in the 1950s, the primary geopolitical objective for America and for the West was to prevent the spread of communism in the Far East and into Europe. So what America did was it started to send large amounts of money and bailouts known as the Marshall Plan to basically bail all of the Western and Central European countries out of their debts. They would take massive loans from the United States with the Marshall Plan to completely rebuild their infrastructure and their economies and become rich and wealthy, opulent nations again. Unfortunately, they also got really heavy into debt. But this time around, the British and the French were able to pay their debts back to the Americans for the loans and interest that they got, unlike what happened after World War I and because of the Great Depression when they stopped paying their loans. This time around, the loans were paid off, and the British, the Americans, and the French got together in their sectors in Germany, and they created the bi-zone, and then later the tri-zone, and then finally they allowed for free and open elections in West Germany. The Soviets countered by setting up the United Socialist Party in East Germany and allowing free, not so free, open elections for socialists and communists in East Germany. When West Germany became a fully sovereign country again, so did the German Democratic Republic. So now there is the Federal Republic of Germany and the German Democratic Republic. West Germany was very successful on an economic front, but it was also at the very forefront of the Cold War. West Germany was at the very center, the very epicenter of the armed ideological struggle between the West and the East for the remainder of the Cold War. Nevertheless, regardless. So anyways, yeah. So we're going into the Cold War, or I'm going into the Cold War. I will talk a little bit more about the process of decolonization, the Vietnam War, and also some other aspects about the nuclear arms race and the space race later on. So I hope you enjoyed this presentation. What's up, Beans? Yes. Beans says yes. Been waiting for you to get around the Korean War. Well, here it is, bro. It's right here. Right now it's happening, bro. I kind of went through it a little bit fast, but yeah. Always been confused on what went down. Confused about what? Over Korea? Confused about the ideological military standoff in Korea? Well, it was mostly just Americans and Chinese blowing each other's brains out, fighting over one of the least important places in the world at the time. What's up, Thievius Slick? Forge Gang! Let's go! What's up, Mac Lewis? My grandfather fought in Korea and said the Koreans fight like cockroaches. Yeah, they did, man. Well, the North Koreans were basically pursuing what they perceived as an anti-colonialist, anti-capitalist, and pro-socialist crusade against imperialism, or US-led imperialism and fascism. and they felt that they were fighting a just and humane war on behalf of all of humanity in an armed socialist solidarity against imperialism. That's literally what they believed. Great trolling on the Kino Corner stream, bro. Are you talking about esoteric? Oh, you mean where I showed the picture of his sister? Yeah. Dude, that was so epic, bro. Mormon Shaggy was so blown out, he didn't even say anything, dude. He was caught speechless. He was in such shock and awe, he literally couldn't say nothing about it, dude. All right, so Warriors of the Shire. What's up, Warriors of the Shire? Good stream. All right, so yeah, the Korean War was one of the few flashpoints in the greater Cold War where there was a very hot contest over land and people and territory between the two different competing power blocks on the globe, on the free market democratic West and the socialist revolutionary Bolshevik bloc. So, anyways, I hope that you enjoyed it, and it's going to get worse. In the late 50s and the early 60s, the Soviets build ICBMs and space rockets. The Americans do the same. The competition goes into outer space, and ultimately it leads to Armstrong setting foot on the moon in 1969. So where does it go from here? Find out next time. I will see you then. Forge Gang Commander-in-Chief out!